Yeah, let's get started. So as Jeroen said, my research for the past years was mostly focused on a field called posthumanism, which in the meantime has many definitions as there are posthumanists maybe. And recently I got more interested in taking the post in the posthuman really seriously. The post then no longer as a kind of working through towards a beyond humanism, but literally post, after, end. So my question was, how do artists consider and shape various ends, think beyond the human, after human presence, or maybe even after extinction? And I wondered what dramaturgies they developed to do so, in order to also affect their audiences, make people care, that big problem of today. So what are possible dramaturgies of the end? And as Jeroen said, in my own experience, mostly with Kristof, performances that deal with ends and endings particularly generate problems when it comes to the ends of these performances. Yeah, this is a bit of a pun, but let's try to take it serious. So, so this talk is in a way a reformulation of a series of ideas on endings and ends I've tried to write down in a chapter of a book that was just published, and I really try to question myself a bit more by reformulating the problem. So in the following, I will like to talk about the final scene, or perhaps the penultimate scene, in two works that deal with end. How to end a performance about ends or unend. How do artworks perform processes of ending? After all, is the end really the end? Can you show the void that remains after something has ended by merely showing nothing? In this lecture, or in this talk rather, I will draw from some concrete experiences, but I would like to start with two considerations. First consideration, the end is not what it used to be. So let's consider what we mean when we say end. Often end has an apocalyptic undertone. In the West it would be a biblical one of floods, of judgment day. Apocalypse in this sense actually implies the beginning of something new, of a whole new order. End can also mean disaster. In the 20th century, we've had most prominently disasters of the atomic bomb and the concentration camps as two human-made events that culminated the world wars and meant an end for many discourses on humanism, for some even an end of poetry. So apocalypse and disaster. But end is also death, the finitude of a life without any particular apocalyptic or catastrophic undertones, merely the end of life in the cycle of life and death. And less gloomy, the end can also be the end of a story, of an evolution or development. And the end could then indicate a return to a beginning, or a process that was completed, a synthesis after a dialectical process of thesis and antithesis, or a resolution. The end of a meal, the end of a project, the end of the line. Just as with death and destruction, after these more banal ends, other things, other forms of life, and other elements actually still continue. Now, what these four ends share is that we think of most of them as events, as limited moments in time and space we can point at. The time of death, the time the atomic bomb fell, the day on which the judgment will be passed, the last page of the book. Now, however, as journalist and writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger has said nicely, the end is no longer what it used to be. There are still many romantic ideas that circulate about the end as an apocalypse. In popular culture and media, this apocalypse can function both as an aphrodisiac, as a nightmare, but mostly as a commodity. So Enzensberger urges us to let go of this idea of end as apocalypse that is actually a double of utopia, kind of negative shadow allowing for a new beginning. Today the end is no longer what it used to be because it is not a divine intervention or merely part of an untouchable and pure cycle of life and death. It will be our own human doing. The apocalypse has become secularized, as some would say. And with that also its temporality has changed. It will no longer be with a bang, it will not be a surprise. Rather a question of time, approaching in slow motion. An important note to make here is that this slowness is not the same for everyone. Even though endings offer a kind of negative universal horizon, they also radicalize inequality in their temporal disparity, depending on geographical location, in terms of class, and so on. So again, with Enzensberger, some watch it on TV, while others live it. That's another important aspect of the secularization of the apocalypse. It will not be there for everyone at the same time in the same way. Now, an important reason for the secularization of the end and its uncoupling of utopia, which makes it actually an undialectical event, is that there are various existential ends unfolding. Ever since the atomic bomb, and now again with the clear science and knowledge about climate catastrophe and extinction and the resurgence of populists, variations of fascism, there is a sense of ending in a large part of the world, particularly I think in the West. And yet things seem to go on in a way while they are ending, which makes the end kind of a horizon with which we have to live. The question is, do we know how to stay with the trouble, particularly that of the end? Finding a way to live with the end would mean the end of a particular idea of the human as a liberal, free, autonomous subject, differing from other animals and non-human objects, mastering each other, their surroundings and tools. Perhaps this idea has always been in the process of ending since its conception. But today, insisting on this view on humanity betrays a deeply reactionary and harmful position. Second consideration. A triangle became a line. So let's go back to theater. If the end is no longer what it used to be, how did theater think about endings in the first place? As a good dramaturge, I turned to Aristotle's Poetics. And this is more than just a pun, because it's actually in the way we structure or don't structure the processes that surround us that determines largely how we give meaning to it and how we are able or not to relate to it. So I think it's really a question of dramaturgy. So, a bit of a recap of Aristotle. According to him, a good tragedy should have an action-driven plot comprised of a beginning, middle, and end, in that order. The middle should be a logical consequence of the beginning, and the middle should also lead towards its logical end. Logical, so according to cause and effect. The end in a classical drama is part of an order, and there is a way things are ordered, namely causality. Everything should be explicable, if not by logical reason, then by God. Towards the end of the play, a good tragedy should include the following elements. Anachronesis, the insight of a character in his own situation, which could then lead to what is called peripeteia, the reversal or turning point, followed by denouement, the unraveling of the story, towards its logical end. And after the end, nothing else happens. If it's a good tragedy, the plot with its elements and characters leads to a catharsis, a cleansing effect of fear and pity that is a consequence from the transformation of a state of happiness to one of sorrow and suffering. And maybe you know this translation of Aristotle's structure into a triangle done by Gustav Freitag in the 19th century, in which he actually maps this trajectory in very classical scenario terms. But you could say that after almost more than half a century of deconstruction of dramatic structures, the end is also no longer what it used to be in theater as well. Thwarting all dramatic development in classical terms. No more story to be told. It is already over before it began. No more logical action possible because teleology has lost its direction. Freitag's triangle has become a flat line, diagonal at most, resembling rather the heart monitor, that flat line. So far for the considerations. The first end would be endlessness. So another dramatic line, how to wrap up a work that took the end as its beginning. First thing that I talk about is Untitled. It was a performance I was dramaturge for with Kristof. We made it in 2014. And maybe to briefly sketch Chris's work, Chris's work deals with the relation between human subjects and non-human objects and other non-human entities. It explores how people are objectified in political and economic systems with the help of technological developments. This in turn makes objects come alive, or rather makes their inherent agency more explicit. This blurring of the boundary between humans and non-humans leads on the one hand to a call for a more conscious relating beyond the boundaries of the human, which also has its consequences for how we humans live together. But on the other hand, it points towards how if we don't change our attitudes and actions, dehumanization and destruction will lead to various endings or ends. In Untitled, we started from the figure of the mascot. First, it was a performer in a mascot suit that is actually not more than a shiny square with a smiley, we call it Cookie. And then a performer in a suit that holds middle between a Mickey Mouse suit and a bee. And this mascot comes on stage without any apparent prepared choreography or show, as if the show were already over and the audience was still sitting there waiting to be further entertained. So the mascot, which is already actually a very good example of an objectified subject, capital-made image, as the bar would say, a merely disposable being, tries to do what it is designed to do, perform. So Untitled shows actually an end of a humane being leading towards exhaustion. And moving towards the end of the performance, these attempts also come to a kind of end. We wanted to delve deeper into the layers of the state of being disposable, dehumanized in industrial pitiless system. So 3 large, shiny inflatable columns emerge out of 3 boxes that were already on stage. The sound of ventilators blowing up is amplified, and together with the crackling of the fabric forms a nightmarish environment that not only I have called a post-human landscape, there are other people in the room included that too. What can still happen in this last scene? What is the place of the human mascot performer in this space? We searched for a long time for gestures, movements, phrases that could convey how actually this post-human landscape is a living environment for many people today. That it is the now and not just the future for a society that requires its inhabitants to perform almost continuously. We couldn't find a place and way to still include human presence, albeit objectified and dehumanized in this world. And so, as many companies do as well, we sent a robot to do the job. The problem with the end in Untitled that we stumbled upon is that by translating the apparatus of dehumanizing performance capitalism into a theatrical apparatus, we created a kind of endless situation. An endlessly self-reproducing apparatus is actually also how philosopher George Agamben has described the dispositives, the systems, the entities that shape human subjects, while also transforming them, destroying them in a way, and that characterize this era of late capitalism. Endlessness, according to the same Agamben, is also what characterizes a realm we know from more religious spheres, namely hell. Endlessness is infernal. The inability to end a performance resonates with the inability to stop in a broader sense. So there is no insight here, no discovery or reversal of events, only continuation and intensification. I will try to give a sense how that looks like. Aha. It's glorious moment. Right before the final scene, which perhaps will always be the penultimate scene, a little Lego robot crosses the stage towards a worn-down mascot. As if to announce that it is over, that no more can or should be done. This end that is at last offered by this Lego robot is a relief in a way. Finally, it's over. But it's no end that offers an actual resolution. The system goes on. Nothing changes. Again, this is an end that we cannot really see in an apocalypse, as it is disconnected from any liberation or eschatology. Translated into Aristotelian terms, this means that there is perhaps a form of catharsis fostered by fear and pity, but this catharsis leaves one suspended above an abyss and actually invades to gaze down into the black nothing. No cleansing effect, rather an altered attitude towards an end. And the endlessness of the theater apparatus in Untitled and its destructive nature point at how in society there is both a tendency towards endlessness, perpetual continuity, as well as a movement towards ends, towards being out of resources, towards destruction, but also towards abandonment and the relief of letting go. As Rosi Braidotti already noted, and I will give a short quote, while at the conscious level of all of us struggle for survival, at some deeper level of our consciousness, of our unconscious rather, all we long for is to lie silently and let time wash over us in the stillness of non-life. The soothing of the death drive in this final scene by the robot's relief makes the question, why do we keep going on, all the more urgent? As it were, precisely the mascot's actions that brought it into a deeper and deeper existential mess. It seems that we are just existing for the sake of existing, as Martin would say. If that is the case, why resist dealing with extinction and death? That seems to be the provocation slumbering in Untitled, and I'm also still trying to understand it. An Italian activist and philosopher, Bifo Berardi, makes it even in a stronger provocation when he says that extinction is not so bad if we compare it to capitalism. The problem of the ends in the final scene in this performance shows how endlessness leads to suffering and could even foster a desire for it all to be over and done with. In Untitled, you really want it to end for his mascot. But no, even after the last scene, he returns, again in his initial cookie square shape, to receive the applause and to wave as if nothing happened, business as usual. Second end. Exhausted theatre in a landscape state of being. This notion of landscape I just used to describe this final scene in Untitled is also a word that suits the following ends of a second performance I would like to discuss here. It's called Conversations at the End of the World. And it starts from the life and work of a Russian writer called Daniel Karms. And he lived and worked in St. Petersburg, or Leningrad, depending on the time, from 1905 until 1942. Karms was subjected to Stalinist censorship, and his surroundings were affected by this purges, disappearances. Karms didn't manage to publish much during his lifetime, actually only 2 poems and some children's stories. He soon ended up in poverty, to die of starvation during the siege of Leningrad, arrested and locked up in a psychiatric prison. Censored, poor and hungry, he kept on writing his short texts, very lively texts searching for little miracles beyond hope. His work happens in a post-apocalyptic world, after the end has already occurred. Out of nothing, he still wrote something, only to let it dissolve again, after having caused perhaps a minor incident, as he would call it. So what to say when the end is unfolding, when in a way it has already happened? In conversations, 5 performers, 4 actors and 1 pianist, find themselves on a stage already covered in a grey mass of beads. They open the show with, a show. Each of them performs the text, accompanied by the pianist. It is as if they are welcoming the audience to a special night, a final evening. The show falters already after 15 minutes and ends in silence, only to be interspersed by short conversations going nowhere little stories, reflections on time, surreal theories about the universe, stories and conversations about death, miracles, and poems and piano pieces. And this end situation develops for another hour and a half throughout these conversations. At a certain point, halfway through the performance, more grey beads start to fall from the theater tower on the stage. This non-stop rain forms the backdrop for the texts that follow. And after a while, the performers take out under the piano some kind of masks that are reminiscent of theatrical masks, ritual masks, death masks, or even gas masks. They put these masks on, sit down in the snow, not to move again, but still occasionally speaking texts that convey only greater disarray, while still attempting to say something about this condition. No longer moving and without a face, they are absent, yet still present, until one by one they vanish. Some just disappear in the snow, others make the decision to retreat. What remains is an empty landscape, still growing and evolving as it continues to snow. Let's see if I can find it. The end of the world in conversations is again enacted by a transition from a theater situation to an installative situation, to a landscape holding the memory of what has become absent: human bodies, performance, language, music. Initially, Verdonk and myself had hoped to find text materials that could be spoken from within this installative landscape. We had built a kind of air beds in which the actors could lie down under these mountains. But we didn't find the right words. We couldn't find the texts that would still make sense to be spoken at that place. And perhaps the only text we still had in our collection, and we had a big chunk of words that made sense, was a nonsensical conversation about imaginary architecture. However, we did not manage to create a satisfactory scene out of it. Imagining the after, in its most literal sense, proved to be a limit, a threshold we could not cross within the frame of this performance. The problem of the end of performance in an endless apparatus here becomes that of the end of language, yet another endless movement of a landscape harboring absence. Language is exhausted, not in terms of fatigue of the performers, but rather as an exhaustion of all options, without the hope or connection to any goal or meaning. And I keep here Deleuze's essay in mind on the exhausted, where he says that the end of communication and production makes precisely anything possible. You press on, but just towards nothing. Conversations at the end of the world, and also the work of Carnes, are, I think, strong examples of this exhausted situation, of exhausted theater, or even post-theater, in which language can do whatever, as can the performers, because it has renounced all need, preference, goal, or signification. Yet still, precisely this exhaustion and whateverness proved to be very difficult qualities to find in language at the point where actually the presence of these performers is gone. And I see now that the poem I wanted to read you is on the screen. I will pause. Another type of end occurs here, one that the same Berardi pointed out as an end of meaning. A world ends when its inhabitants are unable to say anything effective about the events and things that surround them, he would say. And we thought that the language that could remain would have to be at the same time very concrete and had to have no sense at all. It had to be pure nonsense. The risk rises in these kind of situations that you take the disappearance of the performers almost too seriously, as a catastrophic event, whereas this absence was already always there. There is hence a risk of romanticization, of a spectacular representation, or of pathos, a pathos that would make one complicit with the enemy or system that may have caused this ending. So in the end, the only text that was still possible for us was a poem by the same Carnes called Amphibrachie. Amphibrachie is a kind of type of poem. It is the last part of Carnes' blue notebook. And up until then, we didn't really understand this text, as it seemed so atypical. No incidents, nothing happens, no more death, despair, or madness as in the other text of Carnes. Merely descriptions that are tempting to be called pastoral or bucolic, but something feels wrong. And well, I'll just read it because it's with this scenery. Normally it's with a beautiful voice, but it will just be mine. And the little fish flashes in the river's cool wave, and the little house stands far, far away. And the barking dog barks at a herd of cows, and Petrov rides a barrow straight down the hill, and the little flag flutters on top of the house, and nourishing grain grows ripe in the field, and the dust shines like silver in every leaf, and the flies with a whistle fly everywhere, and young girls stretch out in the sun to get warm, and the bees in the garden buzz over the flowers, and the geese are diving in shadowy ponds, and the day passes by in its usual labors. Now, the landscape, as still the critic and scholar Eleanor Fuchs has already noted in the 90s, also puts this whole Aristotelian hierarchy of plot, character, place, time, thinking upside down as it's falling apart. And although Fuchs already made a connection between death and landscape, I think this time the organic cycle of life and death does not lead to a next spring or a new life. This so-called pastoral elegy, as Fuchs would say, that allows for a meditation on death, here becomes a mode of exhaustion, an exhausted landscape. And so this final poem, in this landscape setting, evokes what Agamben has called being en état de paysage, being in a landscape state of being. And for Agamben, this landscape state of being is a state after the end, that no longer seeks to restore what is lost, nor to reignite a form of life on the same foundations of the previous ones. In the landscape state of being, the possibility of relating to something as inappropriable as the end, or alienation and intimacy with the landscape, allows to look at the world anew. Some catastrophes give this landscape state of being a dark affect. Think of Chernobyl or Fukushima, and the areas affected by radiation, but also the air we breathe in cities like Antwerp, Brussels, or Amsterdam, polluted with small particles. It all looks the same, but invisible changes have altered everything, including our sense of belonging and relating to this environment. The flies swarming and the flowers are blooming become part of what Catherine Malabou has called destructive plasticity. And it's a nice counterweight to this being in a landscape state of being. Destructive plasticity means that those entities who are subject to it are characterized by an unsettling indifference. On the outside, nothing has changed, but on the inside, nothing is the same and there is no way back. The performers also don't make their way back to salute, to bow or take the applause. The light continues to grow, brighter on stage, and also starts to light up in the tribune, creating a kind of unified space, including the audience in the landscape state of being, as they are actually the only ones that remain. A curious situation arises. For sometimes as long as 20 minutes or half hour, people continue to take in the landscape, talk a little, walk, watch the snow, take a picture, of course, and go away softly. Not to say end, but coda. Performing nothing. Luckily, we learn from processes we go through. In the two works Chris and I made after Conversations and Untitled, the nothing and the void between existence and non-existence opened up by climate catastrophe or by the complete loss of meaning was the starting point. We found inspiration in the work of Samuel Beckett and the points where it converges with no theater, a Japanese theater form that was made in the 14th century. In Beckett, we were interested in how all action actually lies in the past. Nothing moves forward. Only memories, words, voices remain. Beckett tries to describe the abyss, nothing at the center of being, and the absurdity of the attempts of describing that. In no theater, we were really interested in how, and especially in dream no, Muggen it's called, how these pieces always feature ghosts and seek performativity of the in-between. Particularly, the dramaturgy of no is interesting, in which the same story is told 3 times, but each time from a different point of view. The first time, it is in a sort of third-person perspective. The second time, we go towards a second-person perspective. And the third time, we are in the first-person, intimate, subjective experience of existing at the threshold of disappearance, between life and death, as ghosts do. No and Beckett offered us strategies to start performance after the end, and to delve deeper in this state of being. The theater had previously already been an in-between space, a limbo, but for something out of nothing, a performance for objects, a noise cello player, and 4 dancers, the nothing of nihilistic destruction and of uncanny instead of unhomely existence in a world that is not ours and out of which human beings might soon disappear, was the starting point. Other ends at the beginning. What we see, as Anna Tsing would say, are ghosts of the Anthropocene. These ghosts are not merely already extinct ways of life, or species or landscapes, or the entities that will remain after human presence on this planet. They are also the ghosts from the future, that is, current human actions, inactions, decisions that have an impact on this planet, and whose future consequences already haunt the presence, placed under the horizon of extinction and end. Something out of nothing seeks to give shape to that state of being haunted by extinction, of that speculative ontological condition. In this performance, sections in which a voiceover speaks of destruction and catastrophic landscapes alternate with sections in which large inflatables, performative objects, come down from the theater tower, and parts in which 4 dancers perform what I would call nothingness. Leila Boudreuil, a cello player who creates noise music with her instrument, accompanies parts of this show until she produces a raw crescendo towards the end of the performance, sonically destroying everything that has happened so far, culminating in an imploded dark nothingness. But what is nothingness? Nothingness could be chaos as opposed to order, matter as opposed to form. Nothingness to transition into death, something intimate, individually and collective. The first observation I could make during the process of something was that to perform nothing, something still has to happen. As Beckett famously wrote in What, the only way one can speak of nothing is to speak of it as if it were something. Something has to unfold, to happen, to be an effective intellectual experience of nothingness. But what is then the status of the actions that happen on stage? How to present them without really becoming something? Interesting paradox. And again I return to Agamben, who has this notion of destituent power. It's an alternative to constituent power, a power that exerts itself. Destituent power breaks down power structures without replacing them with other forms of power. Similarly, we could call then something like destituent performance. It would be more about taking away, about exhausting, than about adding or replacing. In something out of nothing also, nothing is produced in both senses of the words. The result is nothing and nothing is made. After all, everything had already ended. Nothing could be done anymore. Choreography is not much more than a series of procedures that enable the dancers to enter what we call the zone, a mode of being on stage in which they can truly do whatever, in which it actually doesn't matter whether they do something or not. The interesting thing about the destituent performance is that it offers an opportunity to render this apparatus of theater itself inoperative. It continues, but without producing anything. The destituent performance emphasizes the impotentiality, in the act of creation, the possibility not to do something. Again, this idea is inspired by Agamben, for whom potentiality always implies impotentiality. He is actually also here inspired by Aristotle, so we are getting in a full circle. In time and space that is ending, this potentiality, or this impotentiality, turns dark. Dark in the sense of Timothy Morton's dark ecology, characterized by nihilism, uncanniness, and also something sweet. And I believe that in the case of the work of Verdonk, but maybe also in broader cases of endlessness, or of finding oneself in a landscape state of being, or in the void of nothingness produced by destituent performance, this sweetness, this sweet darkness, comes from the possibility to relate to impotentiality, to this darkness, to this void, as intimate aspects of life. And many authors, such as Robert Bringhurst or Ian Zwicky, or Royce Cranton, they have all written about the necessity of learning to die in the Anthropocene. These are beautiful books, but they don't tell us that we have to die, of course. Rather, it takes into account and develops an ethics of living after the end, towards and amidst extinction. Accepting one's own finitude is an attitude of humility, and for Berardi it will be the antidote and a way to deal with modernity's destructive path to growth, expansion, and control. Therein lies the importance of understanding and interpreting these dramaturgies and attitudes of ends, as they allow us to search for potentialities that create the conditions for post-apocalyptic times. Thank you.